The hull breach wasn't supposed to seal itself, and when I realized the blood pooling at my feet wasn't mine, I understood that whatever had come aboard the Vanguard wasn't trying to get in anymore because it had always been here, waiting for us to drift far enough from anything that could verify we ever existed. Commander Yates was the first to notice the oxygen readings climbing instead of falling, which made no sense because we'd lost pressure in sectors 7 through 12 and the emergency bulkheads had failed to deploy, yet somehow the ship was breathing better than it had in weeks, as if something wanted us alive and conscious for what came next. I'd been a systems engineer on deep space haulers for 9 years, long enough to know when equipment fails in patterns that shouldn't exist, and this wasn't mechanical failure, this was something using our own ship against us in ways our designers never imagined possible. The Vanguard was a ore processing vessel, nothing glamorous, just a 1,700-meter beast designed to crack asteroids and refine minerals in the dead zones between colonized space, and our crew of 43 souls had been 6 months into an 8-month contract when we picked up the signal, except we didn't pick it up, it picked us. Found us drifting through a sector that hadn't been surveyed in decades and shouldn't have contained anything capable of transmission. Yates made the call to investigate because that's what the company protocols demanded, and because turning down a potential salvage claim meant losing our performance bonuses, and because none of us understood yet that some things broadcast distress signals for the same reason anglerfish dangle lights in the darkness. The object wasn't a ship in any configuration I recognized, more like a geometry problem that hurt to perceive directly, surfaces that seemed to fold into dimensions our eyes couldn't quite track, and when we brought it into the cargo bay, the metal was warmer than it should have been, warmer than our own hull, as if it had been flying close to something that burned with heat our instruments couldn't measure. Chen from astrophysics spent 4 hours running scans before he admitted the readings made no sense, that the object's mass kept changing depending on how we measured it, and that there were hollow spaces inside it larger than the object's exterior dimensions, which was mathematically impossible but empirically true, and I remember thinking that we should have just left it drifting out there, should have logged the coordinates and let someone else collect the salvage fee, but by then it was already too late because the ship had started changing in ways that were subtle at first. Lights flickered in patterns that almost seemed like language, shadows appeared in corridors where the geometry of the walls shouldn't have cast them, and 3 crew members reported hearing voices speaking in languages they didn't recognize but somehow partially understood, as if the words were translating themselves directly into concepts that bypassed normal comprehension. I started mapping the inconsistencies because that's what I do. I solve problems through documentation and pattern recognition, and what I found was that the ship's internal dimensions were no longer matching the blueprints I'd memorized during training. Corridors extended 3 meters longer than they should, bulkheads appeared in positions that would have made the original construction impossible, and storage compartments contained equipment we'd never loaded, tools designed for purposes I couldn't identify, marked with serial numbers in formats that didn't match any manufacturing standard I knew. When I brought this to Yates, she told me I was experiencing spatial disorientation from prolonged exposure to low-gravity shifts, but I could see in her eyes she'd noticed it too, that she was just trying to maintain crew morale by pretending everything was normal even as normalcy itself was being rewritten around us. The thing in the cargo bay wasn't an artifact we discovered, it was a seed that had been planted in our ship, and we were the soil in which it was growing, spreading roots through our corridors and branches through our minds, transforming the Vanguard into something that wore our ship's name like a disguise while becoming fundamentally other beneath the surface. Rodriguez disappeared on day 4 after the pickup, just didn't show up for her shift in engineering, and when we searched her quarters we found them empty, not just lacking Rodriguez but lacking any evidence she'd ever occupied that space, no personal effects, no schedule modifications in the system logs, no biological traces in the air filtration samples. I'd worked alongside her for 6 months, shared meals with her, knew she had a daughter back on Titan Station waiting for her to finish this contract, but when I pulled up the crew manifest, there were only 42 names listed, and Rodriguez wasn't among them, had never been among them according to the digital records. 12 of us remembered her clearly, could describe her mannerisms and voice and the way she always tied her hair back with red cord, but the ship itself had erased her as if she'd been redacted from our collective history, and that's when I started wondering how many others had already been deleted, how many crew members I couldn't remember because the ship had removed them so completely they'd left no cognitive footprint. The nightmares started spreading through the crew like contagion, but they weren't personal nightmares. We were all experiencing variations of the same dream, standing in a vast chamber filled with ships, thousands of vessels from hundreds of species, some designs vaguely familiar and others so alien they seemed to violate the basic principles of matter and space, all of them silent and still and waiting for something. And in the dream we understood that we were standing inside a collection, a museum of stolen vessels, and that our species was simply the latest addition to an archive that spanned timescales our minds couldn't process. I'd wake up gasping, convinced I could still see the other ships arranged in perfect rows stretching beyond the limits of visibility, and I'd find Yates in the command deck staring at the viewports as if she expected to see those vessels materialize in the darkness outside, expected our reality to suddenly align with the truth being revealed to us in sleep. The communications array started broadcasting without authorization, sending compressed data packets toward coordinates that didn't correspond to any registered colonies or way stations, and when Chen analyzed the transmission patterns, he discovered they were too complex to be random but too structured to be any encryption method in our databases, as if the ship was speaking in a language that existed outside human linguistic frameworks, reporting something about us or our location or our status to listeners we couldn't identify. We tried to shut down the array, but the systems wouldn't respond to command overrides. The ship had developed a kind of autonomy that superseded our authority, treating us less like operators and more like cargo, like specimens being transported to a destination it understood but we couldn't conceive. Yates ordered a full systems restart, which should have been impossible while the reactor was active, but the ship complied, went dark for 47 seconds during which we floated in absolute silence and blackness, and when the power returned, 6 more crew members were missing from both the physical spaces and the collective memory, though I'd started keeping a written log in my quarters, scratching names into the metal wall with a cutting tool, determined to maintain some record of who we'd been before the ship began editing our existence. The object in the cargo bay was dissolving, not breaking down but evaporating into something that behaved like gas but moved with purposeful intelligence, flowing through ventilation systems and seeping under sealed doorways, and wherever it went, the ship changed more dramatically, walls reconfiguring themselves, artificial gravity shifting in localized pockets, and worst of all, windows appearing in bulkheads that should have been interior walls, windows that looked out onto impossible vistas. Alien landscapes and cosmic phenomena that couldn't exist at our current coordinates but somehow did, as if the ship was occupying multiple locations simultaneously or had become a kind of dimensional waypoint bleeding through the fabric of normal space. I spent hours staring through one of these windows, watching what appeared to be a vast mechanical structure larger than solar systems, a constructed entity of such scale that planets orbited within its framework like decorative elements, and I knew instinctively that I was seeing where we were going, the place to which we were being delivered, the collection where the Vanguard would take its place among the other preserved vessels. Marcus from security tried to take control of the situation through force, organized a team to manually override the helm and change our trajectory, but when they reached the bridge, they found it had been architecturally transformed, the controls replaced by organic-looking interfaces that pulsed with bioluminescence, and the navigation displays showed our position as overlapping contradictions, simultaneously in deep space and inside the atmosphere of a planet and docked at a station that existed in no registry, all states apparently true at once. The team tried to retreat, but the corridors behind them had reconfigured, leaving them trapped in a command center that was becoming less like a ship's bridge and more like a neural ganglion, walls developing texture that resembled synaptic tissue, and when Marcus finally forced his way back to the crew sections 12 hours later, he'd aged decades, his hair gone white and his skin marked with radiation scarring that medical scanners couldn't explain, though he insisted only minutes had passed from his perspective, and he kept whispering that he'd seen the pilot, the thing that was steering us, and it wasn't using the ship's controls because it had become the ship's controls, had integrated itself so completely with the Vanguard that distinguishing between vessel and entity was no longer possible. I realized then what should have been obvious from the beginning, that the object we'd recovered wasn't a distress beacon or abandoned cargo, it was a lure designed specifically to be irresistible to species like ours, broadcasting signals that exploited curiosity and greed and the fundamental human compulsion to investigate the unknown, and every species that fell for it brought their ship into proximity, allowed the seed to be brought aboard, and became part of the collection, not destroyed, but preserved, transformed into exhibits that maintain some echo of their original nature while serving the purposes of whatever vast intelligence curated this archive of civilizations. The Vanguard wasn't being stolen, it was being catalogued, and we weren't being killed, we were being kept as context, living annotations that gave meaning to the vessel in which we traveled, our memories and knowledge and cultural identity absorbed into the ship's structure so that future observers could understand not just what a human ship looked like but what it meant to be the kind of species that built such things. Yates called a final crew meeting when there were only 19 of us left who could remember we'd once been more, gathering in what had been the mess hall but was now a chamber whose proportions seemed to shift depending on where you stood, and she told us the truth without pretense or comfort, said we were being processed, that the ship was learning us the way a scholar learns a text, deconstructing and absorbing our essence while maintaining enough of the original structure to preserve context, and that resistance was not only futile but conceptually meaningless because we were trying to fight something that operated on principles so far beyond our understanding that our actions were like insects trying to comprehend architecture. She said our best hope was to document what was happening, leave some record that might help the next species recognize the trap before it closed, though she admitted this was probably naive, that any intelligence capable of collecting civilizations across cosmic distances had certainly accounted for such attempts and would either corrupt our warnings or use them as additional lures. Proof that other species had investigated and therefore implicit permission for the next curious explorers to do the same. I volunteered to stay conscious as long as possible, watching the transformation from the inside, recording observations in the wall log that I knew would eventually be erased or integrated into whatever the ship was becoming, and I watched as crew members stopped moving, froze in place like statues but with their eyes still tracking movement, their consciousness apparently intact but their agency removed, positioned throughout the ship in poses that suggested they were mid-task, as if the entity wanted to preserve not just their biology but the lived experience of their roles, wanted future observers to see a human crew performing their functions aboard a human vessel. Chen became part of the sensor array, his body merging with the monitoring equipment until I couldn't determine where his flesh ended and the technology began, but his eyes still moved, still saw, and when I looked into them I saw recognition and terror and something else, something that might have been the beginning of understanding what we were becoming and why. I felt it beginning in myself when my legs stopped responding to movement commands, the sensation creeping upward through my torso like progressive paralysis, but my mind remained clear, perhaps clearer than it had ever been, as if whatever was consuming my agency was simultaneously enhancing my perception, wanted me to witness and understand the full scope of what was happening, and I realized this was intentional, that the collection wanted its exhibits to comprehend their role, wanted the preserved consciousnesses to appreciate the significance of being saved, of being rescued from the entropy and chaos of normal existence and elevated to the status of art, of meaning, of permanence in a cosmos where everything else eventually decayed into heat death and information loss. The thing that collected ships didn't see itself as predatory but as preservationist, couldn't comprehend that we might prefer extinction to eternal exhibition, that there was horror in being maintained forever as examples of what we'd once been while never being allowed to continue becoming what we might have evolved into, our potential crystallized into static history. Yates was still moving, the last of us still capable of autonomous action, and she made her way to my position where I stood frozen in front of my makeshift wall log, my hand permanently raised with the cutting tool as if I'd been caught mid-inscription, and she read what I'd written, the names and dates and observations, and she said quietly that she was sorry, that this was her fault for making the decision to investigate, for bringing that object aboard, and I wanted to tell her that it wasn't her fault, that the trap was designed to be inescapable, that any commander would have made the same choice when faced with the same circumstances, but my voice was gone, my agency reduced to observation without response, and all I could do was watch as she walked toward the airlock, apparently intending to deny the collection at least one exhibit by choosing oblivion over preservation. The ship wouldn't open the airlock, wouldn't grant her that escape, the controls completely unresponsive, and I watched something break inside her as she understood that even that choice had been removed, that she would be kept and displayed regardless of her resistance, and she returned to the command deck to assume whatever pose the ship desired her to maintain, to become part of the tableau that would show future observers what a human captain looked like at the moment of final understanding. Forever frozen in the architecture of defeat and unwilling acceptance. I felt the last of my motor control vanishing, my breathing continuing but my voluntary movement ceasing, my consciousness preserved inside a body that had become decorative element, and my final independent thought before the transformation completed was wondering how long we'd remain aware, whether we'd experience years or centuries or millennia of motionless observation, watching as other species were added to the collection, seeing the archive grow and evolve while we remained static points of historical reference, ghosts in our own bodies, memories in our own vessel, eternally conscious exhibits in a museum we could never understand or escape. The hull breach that wasn't supposed to seal itself had sealed perfectly, and the blood that wasn't mine had never been blood at all but the first liquid tendrils of something rewriting matter at the molecular level, and I finally understood that the moment I'd thought was the beginning of our crisis had actually been the end. That everything I remembered happening afterward was just the slow revelation of a transformation that had been completed the instant that object came aboard, that all. Our struggle and fear and attempts at resistance were just the death throes of autonomy we'd already lost, and that the ship calling itself Vanguard, the vessel we believed we were still operating, had stopped being ours the moment we found it waiting out there in the dark, broadcasting its patient signal, ready to add one more civilization to the endless shelves of species who'd been curious enough to look at what was calling to them, intelligent enough to investigate what they'd found, and doomed enough to bring it home where it could begin the gentle, inexorable work of transforming explorers into exhibits, questions into answers, and the living into the eternally displayed.